In today's video, I want to talk all about impulse responses and why they might be useful to you as a string player. Whether you've got an electric instrument or an acoustic with a pickup on it, I think impulse responses are some of the most important technology we've gotten in the last decade or two. So in this video, I want to cover three main things. Number one, what is an impulse response and why is it useful to us? Number two, how can we use it in a live situation? And lastly, of course, how does it sound? So by the end of the video, hopefully you'll get a great idea of if this is the right thing for you, and you'll be able to tell, what are some of the benefits and the trade-offs, the drawbacks of using an impulse response. I want to give a shout out to my friend Jonathan Humphreys. You might know him on YouTube as the cello coach. He does a ton of cool videos with pop covers on the cello, and he teaches a lot of lessons online, I know. He reached out himself. He had some questions about impulse responses he had seen in a previous video. So it kind of prompted me to start this series that I'm going to do where I just talk about how technology can help us as string players, distortion, compression, talking about impulse responses, digital technology, and how that can be useful to contemporary string musicians. If you're playing violin, viola, cello, whatever, in a contemporary pop rock style. Stay tuned to the channel. I think you're going to find a lot of these videos helpful, and if you're watching this in the future, I'll have a playlist linked in the description of all these videos you can check out. So number one, what is an impulse response? If you break down that phrase, it is what it sounds like. An impulse response is a digital file that captures how an acoustic space reacts to a signal, an impulse, right? And typically, historically, these have come in the form of reverbs. So picture yourself, you walk into a giant church, a big room with hard surfaces, marble floors, hard walls, high ceilings, and you stand right in the middle and you just clap. What you hear is a reverberation that is going to give you a nice picture of what that room actually looks like. If you're just listening to it, I think a lot of people are going to be able to tell, number one, what size room it is, what the surfaces are made of, and maybe even how high the ceiling is. The impulse response is going to be able to reflect the reverberation and also the frequencies that this room favors. Like I said, historically, impulse responses were only used to capture reverbs, but fortunately for us, they can also be used to capture acoustical spaces in the form of an instrument. Now this is a Stradivarius, not a real one, but it's an acoustic violin that's modeled off of the design of a Stradivarius violin. So it's got the dimensions. It's got a very specific sound that sounds much different than this instrument. This is a Guarneri del Gesù copy. It was made by a violin maker in Reading, Pennsylvania. His name's Joe McDevitt. It's a fantastic instrument, but it sounds very different from the Stradivarius copy, also made by the same guy. So this is my personal instrument, and in my opinion, this has a very dark sound. You can actually kind of tell that the body thickness of a Guarneri violin is thicker than a Strad copy, and for that reason, I think sounds a little bit deeper. This leads me to the reason that I think impulse responses are so important for string players, and that's because unless you're spending like $400, $500, $600, for instance, on the Ithaca strings pickup, for example, or a nice DPA mic, your method of amplification for your instrument is going to be confined to a piezo pickup that might not sound the best if you just play it dry. Now, with impulse responses, we can theoretically take that very dry tone of the piezo pickup, something like this. This is the, I think this is the Fishman V200. It's $150 or something like that. I got it a way long time ago. It doesn't sound good, but with an impulse response, I can take the signal I'm playing with the violin, throw it through the IR, that's what that stands for, and we come out with a tone that's much more resembling of what a mic'd up version of this violin might sound like. Alternatively, maybe you're just playing an electric violin, and in addition to the electric tones that you need to cover, you also need to cover some acoustic sounds. Maybe you're in a dive bar and you don't want to take your prized acoustic violin in there. You'd rather instead just take one instrument and press a button. Impulse responses can be very useful to that. And that leads me into point number two. How can we use them in a live situation? For a while, impulse responses were really only accessible through a digital audio workstation interface like Logic, Pro Tools, Cubase, but more recently they've come in the form of guitar pedals. Now, impulse response loading guitar pedals, that's what you would search on Google if you wanted to find some. They can range from $99 up to $600 and even more. The cheapest one would be something like the Moore Radar, and a lot of these IRs, they're advertised as cab IR loading, like guitar cabs like I mentioned earlier, and that's just because of the market. What you gotta look for if you want to use it with violin is that you can load your own impulse responses into it, that it's not locked into what it needs. So something like the Moore radar, you can load specific violin impulse responses into it, or cello or viola, by the way, and then you can use that to shape the tone and then send it into whatever other pedals you've got, or just direct out to the mixing board. However, in my opinion, I think it's most useful if you have some other options like EQ and compression, and in fact, if you can run your dry signal in parallel with the impulse response, you're going to get the best sound out of it that way. So there's some other great options as well. If you want to go up a little bit in price range, you can look at something like the Fishman Aura. That's a nice pedal that a lot of people are using. There's the V-Sound, I forget the name of it, or the Tone Dexter, some of those specific impulse response loading pedals. Something that I use, this is part of the Line 6 Helix series, which is made as tone modeling for guitars and basses, but in fact there's so much customization in here that it's really not limited to just guitar sounds. I am a guitarist primarily, if you can't tell, but I like using the Helix a lot for violin as well. So for instance, you can load the impulse response in here, you can run it in parallel, so you've got 50% dry tone, straight through, no IR, and you've got 50% IR. And then you can, do some more manipulation with EQ, compression, and other tools, add a reverb in here. And this is basically one unit. This runs about $600, and in the last year, this has by far been the most important purchase I've made of gear. So I'm going to use this to demonstrate, which leads me into number 3, how an acoustic impulse response sounds. So I'm going to plug my violin, my electric violin here, into the Helix, and I'll pull everything up on the computer, and you can watch what the work process looks like to get a couple different IR sounds. So the first thing I want to show you is what this violin, which is a great violin, don't get me wrong, I just want to play a little sample of what this would sound like plugged directly into a soundboard or an acoustic amp. It's okay, right? It sounds very dry. Now with the Helix, if I wanted to add an EQ curve, this is the best I could do. Of course, in the Helix, I could add a little bit of a reverb to make it sound more natural. It helps, right? Now if we want to jump into using impulse response technology, this is how you can make it sound like an acoustic violin. Now this is using an impulse response that's supposed to simulate a Calcini violin. This is an impulse response that I picked up. It was free, it's public domain, and I'll have a link in the description to that if you're already using an IR loading pedal. You can just load that in there, and essentially you've got the picture of what this IR sounds like. Now the tone that you heard was using a little bit of manipulation with EQ and compression to improve the sound of it, and also messing a little bit with this mix control here. So the mix is at 70%, so you're hearing 70% IR and 30% direct signal, which is just the dry tone of the violin. Let's boost it up to 100 so you can hear what the IR sounds like by itself. If you were to get one of the base model IR loading pedals with no extra features, this is what an IR would sound like. And in fact, I should bypass the low cut and the high cut. One more time. That's just the IR. Now, a few ways that I've improved it. I found it sounds better if you can mess with the mix a little bit. I went with 70%. So again, 30% the dry tone of the violin. Improves the sound just a little bit. I added in a high cut and a low cut there. Let's get back to where it was. Versus the complete dry tone. Here's just the IR at 70% mix with the low cut and the high cut. Now let's add in the EQ. And then finally, just a little bit of compression. In my opinion, that gives a much more realistic acoustic violin tone. So I'm going to run through a couple different options that we have. If you wanted to use those public domain IRs, we've got one violin that sounds like this. They've named it Calcani, whatever. And then I've got a secondary preset I made. We've got a Klotz violin. And then we've got a third option, a Langhoff violin. So we've got one actual instrument here that we can use to get 3 sounds. Here's the first one again that I was just playing. Let's switch to the second one. And the third one. Lastly, if you want to sound like a viola, you can do that. This is an impulse response with the viola. That's also included in that public domain IR pack. Now, sorry, cellists, I haven't found any public domain impulse responses for cello yet, but there are some stuff out there. It's just usually like $5 or $10 you can find. There's a company that I've been using lately for my IRs. It's called 3 Sigma Audio. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but I do use some of their packs. They do have some stuff with violin, violas, and then they also have the French cello pack, which I think sounds fantastic. I will need an octave down pedal to use this to make it sound convincing, so let me get that set up real quick. So I've got it set up. That's the Electro-Harmonix POG, Polyphonic Octave Generator pedal, the small one. And this is what a cello impulse response with an octave down on an electric violin would sound. Not bad, right? Considering I'm actually just playing a violin. So the point I'm trying to make is impulse responses are incredibly useful. Let's see how some of these would sound with an acoustic violin. Let's start again just with the dry tone of just this violin, essentially what it would sound like plugged into an amplification device like a PA speaker or an acoustic amp. This pickup's pretty brittle. I'm going to turn on the EQ like I did before. No IR yet. Now let's add in an impulse response. Again, you're hearing just the direct tone going through my recording interface. This isn't actually the acoustic tone of the violin. Now, why would this be useful with an acoustic violin? Well, if you're playing primarily an acoustic instrument, if you prefer to play an acoustic one, you can still use IR technology, as you've heard. And in fact, if you're someone like Zach Brock and you prefer to play an acoustic, but you still like using distortion and other crazy effects, you can use something like the Line 6 HX Stomp, the Helix, to add in all these extra effects for you. So I've set up a preset with a chorus sound, a delayed sound, and then a button to switch back and forth between acoustic tones and electric distorted sounds. So let's hear what this would sound like if I added some distortion on it. I can add it in chorus. And I can add in delay. Pretty cool, huh? Hopefully this video was informative, useful to you in some way or another, and again, thank you to Jonathan for setting me up with the idea to do a series of videos. If you're interested in stuff like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel and watch for more. As always, if you have any further questions, you can always book an appointment with me. Check out the links in the description if you'd like a lesson to learn more about this in a one-on-one setting. Alternatively, if you've just got a short question, you can leave it in the comments and I can get back to you. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.